Good morning, Garland Nixon here with the one and only Joti Brar. I know that this is the show that everyone has been anticipating all week, including me. So we've got some great questions from Joti, and this is going to be fun. Let's talk. Hello, that's weird. I'm having problems with the stream going to Rockfin, but okay, it is what it is. We are on YouTube. For those on Rockfin who can't see it, maybe you can, I don't know, but we are for those if you can't, we are still on YouTube and of course on Rumble. So we got at least we're 2 out of 3 ain't bad, as Meatloaf said in the old song, in the infamous song from the 1970s. All right, Joti, let's start with this. One of the things that I think is interesting, something that I heard actually, I never really thought about this conversation, but I heard Caleb Maupin talking about it years ago. That's when I first started thinking about this particular concept, and that is factions of the ruling elite and Bonapartism and factions of the ruling elite enlisting various elements of the working class in their fight against each other. And one of the things I'm seeing now is this. You've got the Europe, which is pretty much crumbling, and you have Elon Musk now, one of the tech bro, the libertarian tech bros. Elon Musk being the leading edge of that now, feeling as though they're coming to ascendancy in the U.S. And some of the more traditional old money having things they want to do the way they want to do things, and Elon Musk, calling into Europe, no, we've got to have these people in charge or this group in charge. Well, no, the AFD, they're the ones that ought to be in charge. And it seems to me that there are various factions of the ruling elite. And as I said, the tech bros feeling as though they're in the libertarian tech bros feeling as though they're in their ascendancy. But there seems to be now, as there's great economic woes on the horizon, if not already here, that they're starting to fight it out and battle it out and get angry at each other. What are your thoughts on that?
Interesting question, Garland. So, just from a kind of general point of view, it's absolutely right that the ruling class is not a homogenous whole. And we've talked before, haven't we, Garland, about how the capitalist system is characterized by competition. And the competition in any capitalist society is three-sided. So there is competition between capitalists over, market share, etc. So they compete with one another. There's competition between workers and capitalists for share of wealth that is produced by the workers, because the smaller the share that goes to the workers, the greater the share that goes to the capitalists as profit. So wages and profit are inversely proportional as ratios of the wealth that's produced. And then there's competition amongst workers for jobs, because there aren't enough jobs to go around, right? Under capitalism. That's not like a law of nature, but it is a law of capitalism, right? So under the capitalist system, you have this competition, which is in all directions. And then, of course, in global capitalism, you have competition between groups of capitalism. And in monopoly capitalism, you have, you seem to have solved the problem of competition by formation of cartels in an area of the economy. 3 or 4 companies will come to dominate, and they'll make a kind of a peace agreement between themselves in order to get bigger profits. They'll basically carve up the market between amongst themselves and allot one another shares of the market, and they'll indulge in price fixing. So that means monopoly engenders bigger profits, because you can fix the prices, fix the market, and carve it up between yourselves. But still within the cartel, as the balance of forces changes, the contradictions and the competition within the cartel still carries on. And cartels under conditions of capitalism never last forever. They tend to be, in fact, relatively short-lived. You know, a crisis or a change in the balance in the powers of one of the partners will make the cartel dissolve, and open competition breaks out once again, and the big will try to eat the smaller, right? That's because the fundamental law of capitalism, when it comes to the capitalists, is the big eat the small. And that is a historical process that's been going on from the very earliest days of capitalism. There never was a level playing field. We talked about this many times, haven't we? There was never such a thing as a level playing field. And it's absolutely impossible to have one at this stage of the game after hundreds of years of the development of, you know, bigger and bigger kind of tranches of capital. So competition is at the heart of the system in every direction. And on the other hand, you were talking about this this question of mobilizing the masses when there are contradictions between workers, between sections of the bourgeoisie. Now, this is also absolutely true, whether it's to get votes or because they need foot soldiers to carry out their program. The ruling class has always needed the working class. So first of all, it needs them to produce the wealth, to work for wages, and to be exploitable matter. It also needs it in the fight between sections of the ruling class. There are different interests in the ruling class. And very often today, what we see, the dividing line tends to be between the very, very big and the not quite so big. The very, very big will have interests in one approach to dealing with the economic crisis. And very often their approach will be something that allows them to survive at the expense of the smaller. So of course that creates a lot of friction, antagonism, resentment, anger. But the very, very big are the more powerful. They're the ones who can buy the most politicians. They're the ones who can buy the most media. They're the ones who can fundamentally buy the most governments and buy the most state machines, which is what they do, right? But the smaller are not so small that they can't have an input into those things. So they'll be able to control some heads of state and some levers of power, some parts of the media. And this debate you see in the media that shows you we have a thriving democracy what it shows you is we have a thriving bourgeois democracy. The bourgeoisie is fighting, and these different ideas represent the interests of different sections of the ruling class. A good example of how the ruling class, different sections of the ruling class have tried to mobilize the working class on their side can be seen in British industrial history. In the early part of the 19th century, the industrialists, the industrial employers, were mobilizing very hard, spent a huge amount of money campaigning for the repeal of the Corn Laws. The Corn Laws were protective tariffs for agricultural produce in Britain. They stopped cheaper agricultural products from the rest of Europe coming in and undercutting them in the British home market. That kept their profits up as the major land owners, the landed aristocracy. It also kept the price of bread high. So when the section of the ruling class engaged in industry, the industrialists were campaigning to repeal these laws. They did it in the name of free trade, and they tried to mobilize the working class on their side to say, look, this is going to lower the price of bread. And if the price of bread goes down, your life is going to get so much better because your wages will go so much further, right? Don't you want the things you buy have to buy every day to be cheaper? And of course, many workers fell for this argument that they should join the free trade campaign because it would bring down the price of their necessaries, in particular the price of bread, right? Now, the trick that was at the heart of that campaign that pretended to be really caring about the workers. And Marx made this point very cuttingly at the time. He said, these people who are spending a fortune on this campaign and tell us, and they're trying to tell the workers that it's all in their interest, like they just want to benefit the poor working class who are having such a hard time. They are the very same people who institute their own private penal codes in the factories and look for ways to dock the wages of their employees for like everything. Like you sit down accidentally, your wages are docked. You know, some of the goods are shoddy, your wages are docked. You know, you went to the toilet too early, your wages are docked. They got a million things that they will, infractions that they'll take. And they actually employ overseers whose job it is to look for ways to dock the wages of the workers, right? So these are the same people who are then spending an absolute fortune trying to repeal the Corn Laws and then presenting themselves to the working class as if they're doing it all as a public good. We just want your lives to be better, workers. Is that what hypocrisy? In fact, they wanted the price of bread to be cheaper because that would mean that wages would fall. So the workers were not going to get anything out of it. In fact, they were going to be worse off because, as Marx pointed out, when the price of bread was high, if a worker decided to eat a bit less bread one week, the money he saved was enough to spend on something else. But if bread costs virtually nothing, you know, not only have your wages gone right down, but deciding to eat a little bit less bread one week won't leave you anything to spend on anything different, right? So Marx kind of made these points in a speech on free trade back in the like 1840s. So the ruling class was mobilizing the working class. The industrial ruling class was mobilizing the workers on this false promise that if they helped this campaign and made a public outcry for the, you know, free trade, i.e. bring down these tariffs, they were going to benefit. And of course, it was a trick. But the working class and the landed gentry got their revenge because very soon after the Corn Laws were indeed repealed, the landed gentry finally threw its weight in behind a long-running campaign that the workers had not been able to get off the ground. For 30 years, they'd been demanding the shortening of the working day. At that time, the normal working day in a factory was 12 hours. And they'd been campaigning for a 10-hour working day for years and years and years, and everybody was against them. But after the repeal of the Corn Laws, the other faction of the ruling class decided to get on board with this demand. And finally, the 10 hours bill was passed very soon after that. So you see this competing interests, different sections of the ruling class. And each time, you know, they need workers as part of those campaigns in order to be successful, to build up a head of steam and you know, be the foot soldiers for the campaign. You know, and today, when we see how small the ruling classes really are in numbers, you know, it's not like in the days of, you know, the early days of the Industrial Revolution when there's, you know, untold thousands of capitalists. There's very, very few capitalists with the kind of money that can, you know, have any impact on the social discourse today. So when we're looking at these different factions, and there are bigger ones and smaller ones, it's all relative. They're all enormous compared to the ones we're talking about in Victorian times because of the concentration of wealth that's gone on in the meantime. And they absolutely, if they're fighting amongst themselves, they absolutely have to mobilize workers on their side. They have to, you know, it's like people often talk about in our country, Tory and Labour, as if Tory's the party for posh people and Labour's the party for workers. But you can't have all these Tory governments constantly being elected without working class votes. It's not possible, right? So clearly they have to shape a message that tells a section of the working class that this is for you and why the other side is not for you. And that is, again, that's something that's kind of built into how our political system works now. What I notice, you know, overwhelmingly since, I don't know how long it's been going on, but, you know, in my kind of political lifetime, certainly in the last 20 years, when you look at the war in Iraq and all the others, what's been very clear is that the most dominant, and I presume biggest sections of big capital are still those that are vested in oil, banking, and armaments. And of course, they're interlinked. I think the biggest financiers are the ones that have their major holdings in those, and they, as I say, they interpenetrate. But you see why? Because of course, banking, finance is over everything, but oil is what fuels the industrial machine and the war machine still, and armaments, of course, is what fuels the imperial machine. So those three are so essential for the maintenance of imperialism as a system, banking, oil, and armaments, that their interests come to dominate everything. And if you look at, for example, when I looked at what happened in the lead up to the war on Iraq in 2003, there was a very obvious divide amongst the British ruling class at that time regarding the prosecution of the war. And we saw Tony Blair, the British Prime Minister at that time, came down very strongly in favor of oil, banks, and armaments. And it was clear that those were the interests that wanted to stick with the USA and keep waging this war. And those interests have been totally dominant in Britain for some time. But there was very clearly another section of the British ruling class that wasn't as strong, but was able to influence the public debate. And Robin Cook, who was the Foreign Secretary, I think, of the Labour Party at that time, he famously resigned over the Iraq War. It wasn't some kind of great, it was always presented like he's a great act of principle, but basically, he represented the section of the British ruling class which agreed with the European ruling class that this wasn't the right way to go about disciplining Saddam Hussein. They wanted to do business in Iraq. They didn't want to destroy it. They wanted to sanction Iraq and keep starving its children to bring it into line, but they did not want to bomb it to oblivion, right? And this, I mean, you must remember all of the narrative that was coming out of the USA at that time. What they came up with a hilarious description for the French, right? Because the French wouldn't get on board with the war. Something like cheese-eating surrender monkeys. Something.
Oh, yeah. That's it.
They rebranded French fries to freedom fries. You remember all that, right? There was this whole thing about how cowardly the French were and how they were funking their duty to go and bomb the crap out of Iraq, right? It was a big propaganda campaign, but in Britain there was a definite divide, and it was so sharp that before the war started, a big section of the ruling class actually backed the anti-war movement. That's why the anti-war movement in Britain, on February the 15th, 2003, we had 2 million people on the streets, Garland. You've never seen anything like it in this country. And a big part of that mobilization didn't come from the anti-war movement. It came from the bourgeois press. We have a paper called the Daily, I always get these muddled up, Mirror, which on the day before that demonstration, I think it was, they printed a big front page which had a picture of Tony Blair with a hand like this, covered in blood. It said blood on his hands, right? That's before the war started. They printed placards, the Daily Mirror, and delivered them to the demonstration, right? So they were mobilizing for that demonstration, for the anti-war movement, because they wanted to put pressure on the government not to launch the war. After the war had started, they all got on board with it, right? They all got on board with the narrative and, got in line. But you saw this very obvious split in the ruling class at that moment, because when the ruling class is united, you don't see these chinks in their narrative arcs, in their storylines. The war on Yugoslavia was very, very different. The war on Yugoslavia, there was one propaganda line coming from everybody. And because the war was over, we never got that pushback from the resistance, for a difficult occupation to start to make the chinks. So most people in Britain still have no idea what a horrific crime the war in Yugoslavia was. They don't know what was done there. They don't know why it was done. They don't know how they were lied to. None of those things came out because the ruling class was in lockstep and they managed to get the war over with quickly, and they didn't have to do a big occupation where they were fighting a resistance movement. And so, you know, their lives were never really exposed to the mass of British people, unlike the lies they told about Iraq. So you start to get an idea from that, I hope. I'm giving kind of historical examples, but the way that, number one, the ruling class has to mobilize workers on its side if it wants to put pressure in a debate. Number two, when you see differences of opinion in the media, that's the ruling class arguing amongst itself. Those are things that I think are really helpful to understand.
You know, one of the things that I find interesting here is this discussion, the term Trump, right? And I use it and in various contexts. But for instance, people are talking about the European, the Ukraine conflict. And so this is what they said: Trump wants out, which clearly I would agree with that. Trump, but depending on what you mean by the word Trump. But Trump wants out, and Trump saying, look, we're out of here. We got that, blah, blah, blah. And lately, I've been thinking this. In the same way that people use this term, the collective Biden, because clearly Biden's, you know, he's not completely with us, shall we say. I think there has to be a term, collective Trump. Trump's like, look, I've done enough. We need to get out of here. We need to run. And you're seeing some articles in mainstream media aligned with that. It's same as you said, in mainstream media, you're seeing some articles in mainstream outlets about how we should leave, why we should leave, how we can leave, how Trump. And I thought to myself, there's no way in the world that Donald Trump's saying we should get out of that and that he's getting support unless there is a faction of the ruling elite that wants the hell out. And as I look at that, I recall Elon Musk and a couple of other billionaires say, you know, I'm kind of scared of World War III. I'm kind of scared we're going to get nuked. And I thought, you know, if I'm a billionaire and I'm thinking, hey, the world's my playground, I can do anything I want to. I'm having all this fun. Hey, they're going to screw it all up with the nuclear war. So that I've come more to the conclusion, it's not just Trump saying I want out, that there is a faction of the ruling elite that wants this thing over and wants out, and they're looking at the Biden knuckle dragger saying, you're going to screw up our playground. We're billionaires. The world's our playground. We got Bentleys and we got our own helicopters. We got $500 million yachts. We're having so much fun. If there's a nuclear war, that all goes away. Come on. This has to stop. So the discussion of Trump wanting out is really, there's a faction of the ruling elite that have said, we want out. Even Trump coming to power, Elon Musk behind him, Peter Thiel, Trump couldn't have won unless there's unlimited money and power behind him. So my thought is this: it's not just that, quote, Trump wants out of Ukraine. There's a faction of the ruling elite that said, we want out of Ukraine and we'll support Trump and we'll get out of this. And we'll go on to whatever diabolical deeds we're going to do with imperialism, but we don't want to get nuked. This thing's getting a little too hot and dangerous for us. Do you think I'm wrong in my evaluation of those who appear to be in a hurry to exit out of that conflict? That it's not just Donald Trump, the individual, woke up, says, I think I want to get out and I'm going to drag everything along with me. I don't think it works like that, Joti.
You're absolutely right. It doesn't work like that. And it's extremely unhelpful to working class understanding of the state and the system that politics is talked about as if it's about individuals and individual decisions and personalities and all the rest of it. Of course, that is not an accident. That way of discussing things is deliberately confusing, precisely to keep the working class from understanding such things as class and class interest. The ruling class understands class, and it wants very much that the working class doesn't understand class. That's why they rubbish the concept all the time to us and try to tell us, oh, if you identify as working class, you're almost kind of insulting yourself, you know. Of course, they just don't want us to understand that this is a class society, it's a class system, and we have class interests. But they know very well they do have class interests, that they are a class. And you're absolutely right. There was a section of the ruling class that has installed Donald Trump into office in order to try to put their program into action. Their program is still a program that is in favor of imperialism. It's not like they're anti-imperialists, or they're out for peace, or they're out to save the working class from the, they will tell the workers all kinds of things because they have to. They have to get their votes. They need to have some legitimacy and power. They need to mobilize the workers for aspects of their program. So they have to tell the working class things, and they'll tell them, Donald Trump, the one thing, that he or his speechwriters, I don't know how he works as an individual, but, Team Trump are quite good at presenting themselves as noticing, caring about, and wanting to address some of the big problems of the working class. That doesn't mean that they care about the problems of the working class. It means that they've understood how to appeal to the workers. And that's an important skill, in bourgeois politics. Used to be considered an important skill, certainly. And, I think maybe one of the things that makes people feel, they do it with Nigel Farage as well. It constantly makes me laugh that these, it shows you how kind of surreal our politics have become, and how detached the ruling class has become once again from the idea that they even have to look as if they have any connection with the masses. That someone like Donald Trump or someone like Nigel Farage, who do a kind of populist politics in the sense of paying attention to and paying lip service to the concerns of the masses, are presented like they're some kind of common people, and people mythologize about them and try to make stories about how they're really kind of everyday, down to the earth, salt of the earth type people. And you're like, are you crazy? I mean, Nigel Farage is a city banker, and Donald Trump is, the inheritor of some huge real estate fortune.
27,000, I think. I think, if I'm not mistaken, I think his father left him 27,000 apartments.
Oh, right. Not 27,000 pounds or dollars. 27,000 apartments.
Plus other, it's kind of hard to fail. If you got 27 apartments with what it costs in Washington, D.C. now for an apartment, I don't have to tell you, London, 27 of them, you're in pretty good shape. 27,000 of them, you're worried. You're flying around on a plane with your name on the side of it, TRUMP.
So the idea that the media can successfully sell a narrative of Donald Trump, or the Trump-aligned media can successfully create this myth of Donald Trump, the everyday guy, the anti-establishment figure. Well, if he is anti-establishment in the sense that he represents slightly smaller capital with a slightly different approach to how to manage the crisis that US imperialism is in, well, then yes, he's anti-establishment. But the idea that he's anti-establishment, like a working class disruptor, is laughable. What he does represent, as we said earlier, is that there's a division amongst the ruling class. Sorry, I keep doing that. We saw it when he was standing for election the first time. And it was very clear at that time that the discussion was very much along the lines of protectionism versus war to get out of the crisis. Protectionism versus trying to get out and expand your markets elsewhere. And, says, well, if we just build a wall around America and protect our home market, put up tariffs, then at least we can dominate the home market and, not have all these cheap goods undercutting us. And, that's very much a strategy of smaller imperialists and capitalists. And in the end, it's not going to get you out of the crisis, right? This is one thing that people should understand. None of the options that different factions of the ruling class put in front of the working class and try to sell them as the solution to their problems, none of them is going to solve the working class's problems. None of them. The ruling class are fighting about how to try to survive an existential crisis to them and their system, their ability to keep taking profits, their ability to keep exploiting the working class, right? That's fundamentally where their wealth comes from. They're not about to abolish that, right? Whichever one of them wins out, the working class is going to get poorer. The working class is going to bear the brunt of the strategy. right? It's going to be at their expense fundamentally. You know, if machinery, you know, in most crises, there tends to be a kind of focus on streamlining businesses so they become more profitable. Usually means merging to make them bigger, so they have a bigger market share. They can have economies of scale, producing bigger. What does that mean? It means more automation, which means fewer workers. It means cutting out kind of slack. When you put two companies into one, there's a bunch of roles you can get, so less workers, right? So whichever ways the ruling class tries to find to get out of its crisis, the workers are the ones who pay the first and the biggest price, as the capitalists are desperately trying to be the ones who survive. And of course, while they're fighting to be the ones who survive, the capitalists are busy eating one another and throwing one another to the wall as well, which is why we see all this shouting, you know, because there's lots of capitalists who are going to the wall or about to go to the wall and very anxious about the fact they feel like they're going to go to the wall. And ultimately, you know, imperialism can't survive without going to war. You know, we have Donald Trump's talking about reversing a situation, you know, for all of the fantasies of the Trump campaign and the section of the ruling class that Donald Trump represents. It is a fantasy to imagine that US imperialism can remain at the top of the world pile while being a country that really survives by sucking the wealth out of the rest of the world. And particularly the extent to which production has been distributed around the world in order to make it more efficient, i.e. more profitable, right? Each bit, you know, and production lines have been stretched out because it's, you know, at some moment it's been more profitable to do this bit of the product in this country and this bit in this country and this bit in this country. And all of that means that the goods which are sold to the US workers are very, very cheap. But why are they very, very cheap? They're very, very cheap because the workers involved get nothing. They're producing wealth, but being paid absolutely nothing. And in order for that situation to remain stable, you need the military might of the US empire to keep every single country in line. The countries that produce the raw materials have to be kept in abject poverty so that we can take their raw materials for nothing. They have to be kept, you know, on the brink of chaos and starvation, so that you can basically take their oil or their uranium or their lithium without hardly paying for it, right? That's one of the bases of the privileged life of the people in the imperialist countries, and the profits of the imperialist financiers. That's where their profits come from, keeping the world's people in abject poverty while they produce the goods and the raw materials that feed, you know, the production machine. And all of that requires that the whole world has to stay in the place that's been allotted to it. So you have to constantly work to suppress every freedom struggle, because every place that gets free is messing with this equation and unbalancing, you know, the system and its ability to keep looting the world. Donald Trump talks about onshoring and bringing jobs back to the USA. But I think it's a fantasy, to be honest with you, Garland. The idea that imperialism, US capitalism can stay profitable by bringing back all those industrial jobs to the USA. The only way it could possibly do that is if the standard of living of the massive US workers was pushed down to the standard of living of the uranium miners and cobalt miners of Africa. Are they going to accept that? Is that going to happen? Could you do that with stability and then have an industrial working class living in basically Victorian type conditions, working 12, 13, 14 hours a day, maybe kids working in the factories as well, you know, women and children, your children up down to the age of 5 or 6, you know, are the working classes in the West going to put up with that? You know, and what about the raw materials that they need? You know, do they produce them all? Suddenly, you know, Donald Trump's talking, on the one hand, he's talking about, you know, kind of fortress, you know, America. But then it's like he suddenly realizes, oh, well, we also need all these raw materials we don't have. So how are we going to do that? oh, well, we'll have to take Greenland and Canada and Mexico and Venezuela. And, so suddenly America just got a lot bigger, didn't it? So which one is it? And there's a contradiction at the heart of Donald Trump's program that he doesn't have an answer to. And fundamentally, no capitalist and no imperialist has an answer to the fundamental problem at the heart of their system, which is because of production for profit, concentration of wealth, immiseration of the people, you can only keep the system going through, number one, making the workers poorer and poorer, but that makes the crisis bigger and bigger, and by war, by destroying workers, by destroying means of production that you can't use, by destroying, infrastructure that you can then rebuild, by and conquering countries that are not yielding you the most profit at the moment. So the whole thing just kind of basically doesn't add up.
It makes sense to me. And I think the other thing is people who are looking at Donald Trump saying, well, he wants to get us out of Ukraine. He's a great guy and he wants to do that to save us all from nuclear, blah, blah, blah. I think that getting out of Ukraine is something that he would do. It kind of like the FDR. FDR said he saved capitalism because at that point, capitalism had crashed and the revolution was in the air. People they had, gigantic tent cities, kind of like now. And they were on the end. People were only, again, they were sharpening up the guillotines and the torches and pitchforks were coming out. And he recognized, we better hand some crumbs back to the working class or they're going to cut our heads off. And, at the point where capitalism gets in a calamitous situation, there are members of the ruling elite that says, hey, time out. We better give these people some crumbs back or they're going to cut our heads off. And they're fighting with the old money that says, no, that's not what we do. That they're fighting with the Marie Antoinette's let them eat cake. Right. And I think that's where we're at. Whenever you get to that point of calamitous collapse of capitalism, I think the fight between the ruling elite is the old money that says, let them eat cake, who cares, who don't even see they're about to get their heads cut off, and maybe a faction that says, whoa, time out. We got to better give them back some crumbs so we can keep the working class at bay for a while, because I don't know if you can count or not. There's more of them than us. And if they ever get pissed off enough, they win. And I think that's the fight. So in a way, the Trump let's get out of Ukraine is the faction of the ruling elite that aren't the old let them eat cake faction. It's we got to give them some crumbs. We got to turn the volume down. We got to do some things to kind of give us a little bit of time to stretch this out a little bit. It's those who recognize the power of the masses and figure we got to mitigate the power of the masses before they get too pissed. I think that. Anyway, that's the thought. What do you think?
There definitely is a faction like that, Garland. I'm not entirely sure, and forgive me because I don't follow US politics maybe as much as I should. I'm not entirely sure if Donald Trump does represent that faction. What I see very much in Donald Trump is that he has agreed with all the ruling class that the major enemy is China. And what he doesn't get is why we don't just focus on China. He has always felt, and there is a section of the ruling class that agrees with him, that Russia was a distraction from China, where the dominant section of the ruling class felt that Russia was a stepping stone to China. Now, this stepping stone idea, we see it everywhere. Syria, unfortunately, now has fallen, but is not going to be the stepping stone they think. But, Iraq was a stepping stone to Syria. Syria was a stepping stone to Iran. Iran was a stepping stone to Russia. Russia's a stepping stone to China, right? There's this whole, in their mind, if you take this down, that's an ally for that. And that, it's the giant chessboard.
If I may add one thing, and I think you have to add this into the mix, that along with that, but in the US and I'm sure in the UK, there is also an element that has this pathological anger, hatred, racism towards Russia. You know what I mean? There's a there's, the Victorian, there's a group and they originate from Eastern Europe. And they have a pathological hatred for Russia, the Soviet Union, the Bolshevik Revolution. You know what I mean? So within there, there's an element, and I know here in Washington, D.C., and I'm sure in the UK, that they even separate their pathological hatred for Russia out from their grand scheme, so much so that they are screw all the rest of their devious plan. Oh, we're going to rule the world. But first of all, God, we hate these Russians and these Bolsheviks and all these people. So it's more important to deal with Russia because we hate them and the Soviet Union and blah, 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 than all of that. And they in a way do get distracted by their pathological hatred of all things Russia. What do you think?
You know, this is something very interesting you point to, Garland, which is the interaction between individuals and a class program. Now, what you're putting your finger on there, I think, is that the ruling class did a very good job of, number one, creating Russophobes in Eastern Europe from amongst the former aristocratic classes that were dispossessed by the revolutionary process of the Soviet Union and Eastern Europe. And number two, harnessing their energies, activity for implementation of their anti-Russian program. It's very much similar to what you see with the Zionists. Zionism was not interesting to the US ruling class until it decided to take over control of the Israeli settler colony. And then Zionism was very useful. Israel became the key plank in US foreign policy in terms of its geostrategic, ambitions in the world, the need to control oil. We've talked about the number one commodity for modern imperialism was and remains oil. And so the oil of the Middle East, to control it, and to control it for two things. One is so you have a steady supply of cheap oil. But the second one is if you monopolize the supply of oil, you can also, you're the gatekeeper of access to oil for everybody else. So you can starve your competitors of oil as and when you want to. This has always been something, Lenin talked about this in his book on imperialism long before Israel existed and, the US had a settler colony. This has been a tactic of the imperialists. One of the reasons for monopoly, for grabbing territories around the world was to secure sources of materials and to deny them to your competitors, right? Because it gives you then a competitive advantage. And the USA has indeed had a competitive advantage from its ability to control the world's oil supply. You stack. That's what monopoly does. You stack the deck, right? So the big get bigger by virtue of the kind of gravity of their wealth and how it enables them to suck up more wealth, disproportionately more wealth than other people. It's not like if you got 10 million and someone's got 1 million, then the 10 million will attract 10% interest, and so will the 1 million. No, the 10 million will be able to attract twice as much as the 1 million because of the ways in which the weight of money, the more of it there is, the more it can do and attract and bend markets and penetrate into all kinds of areas. So to get back to your point, the Russophobic individuals were created by imperialism for a purpose and have been harnessed by them to fulfill a program. But for all their fanaticism and lunacy, let's not forget that when they become too lunatic, the ruling class puts them aside. Victoria Nuland, the lunatic in charge of Ukraine, was put aside at the point at which her lunacy was becoming a liability. And so is Joe Biden's regime in toto being put aside when its lunacy, which was very useful to the ruling class when that was the decision they'd taken. But they've been beaten. They've been beaten and they're looking for a way out. And it's very useful for the ruling class to have this two-party system to give the impression that the change in policy came from Donald Trump and not from a recognition of the fact that they lost the war. It's much easier to sell that narrative. It keeps people's faith in the system. And then whatever happens, so then the Democrats will keep telling their people, if only Donald Trump hadn't got in, we were in another 6 months, we'd have won that thing. We just needed to put a bit more money, it would have all been fine, right? You can keep that narrative going amongst the people who still believe in the Democratic Party and to the people who want the end of the war, you can tell them that Donald Trump's their guy.
And blame it all on Biden, the individual. That Trump's already started. I did a video about it. His way out is Biden did this. Look what Biden did. And even the ruling class elements around Biden at some point step aside. Biden won't even know it. They step aside and they sacrifice Biden at that altar, and all of the errors and all of the terrible, stupid things that were done for the last 4 years that were fully backed by the whole machine. They all step aside and say, doggone it, it was all Joe Biden.
I mean, they've done this. Donald Trump endlessly does tweety type social media things, doesn't he? Relating to what a farrago it was that Joe Biden presided over in Afghanistan. Now, there's many crimes you can accuse Joe Biden of, but the war in Afghanistan went for 20 years, and it was lost because of the resistance. Not because Joe Biden came into office and then the next day suddenly Afghanistan collapsed. Like, what kind of narrative is that? And, you know, you have to keep people very stupid to be able to manipulate them with narratives like that, which are so simplistic and stupid and don't add up with any of the facts or any, you know, you keep people constantly devoid of any historical context for any situation, so they've got no information that makes sense of it, and they just bombard them with silly stories one after another, and they can't keep up with them all, and you just get this, you know, nobody with a little bit of application of thought and a little bit of investigation into the facts and the history could buy this idea that the collapse in Afghanistan was something to do with Biden coming into office, right? But yet, you know, Donald Trump does this kind of showmanship thing, which is all about, and he's not the only one, you know, it's very much how bourgeois politics works. It's a kind of one-upmanship. We had it just recently. As soon as Keir Starmer came into office, you know, there was going to be a change in approach by the ruling class, which was why they wanted Keir Starmer in. And what did he start doing immediately? He started saying, number one, oh, the Tories did this, the Tories did that. We have to break all the promises we made to you, because the Tories left us with this mess. Oh, when the Tories were here, they did this, they did that. You know, the whole of his first sort of 3 months in office was just a string of lines about how awful Boris Johnson was, how awful the Tories were, you know, why they've left this mess, that we have to clean it up. And, oh, by the way, everybody, that means you're going to have to tighten your belt. But don't worry, we're all in it together. You know, so they play these games with the voters very much, you know, through the media and manipulation of the people. But just to come back to this question of the section of the ruling class that has a conscience or has a little bit of awareness about the anger that's building amongst the workers, I think it's a much lower section, if you mind. So I think personally, and you know, I might turn out to be totally wrong about this, I'm kind of speculating, the sense that I get is that Donald Trump represents more the section of the ruling class that thinks that the way to survive this crisis is just to take on China head on, you know, find a way to undermine, first economically undermine, and then, you know, destroy China. And they feel like Russia has been a massive distraction. There were a lot of people who thought Russia, like I said, would be a stepping stone to China. And as that plan to destroy Russia has become more obviously a failure, the people who were always saying, no, we've got to focus on China, have become much stronger because Russia's obviously a failure, right? So they've got more kind of cards in their hand, if you like, at this point.
If I may throw something at you, a little bit of a contradiction. So that the tech bros have, right? And I'll throw something a little bit different at it. Recently, one of the interesting things that happened is Apple decided, hey, we're going to move our iPhone production to India, right? Because the Biden administration was all on, we're going to go start a war with China. Hooray! War with China is coming. We'll dash China to pieces. So, of course, iPhone, well, we got to build our somewhere else. We're going to move to to India. And they found out literally that they can't, that there's no way to do that, right? Can't do it. Can't get there from here, as REM said. Now, here's what I think. Throw this at you. And that Tesla, they got all these factories. They make a lot of money through China. I think, what about this as a possibility? That, again, speculation, looking at the tech bros who make a lot of money in China, so they kind of need some of the resources of China, that maybe, and looking at Trump, who seems less inclined to war, that the tech bros don't necessarily want to crush and destroy and go to war with China. They're scared as hell of nuclear war. They want to subjugate China. They want to keep China there as a resource, but a resource that's under control instead of a resource that's growing. That they want to whip China into control. That they, because you know what I mean? The tech bros still need China. It is a foundation. They need that labor. They need a lot, and they're making a lot of money off China. So if China goes away, that's a problem for them. But maybe they have a different, anyway, your thoughts on that?
I certainly think that Donald Trump and the people around him prefer economic warfare to military warfare. I think that's true. And I think it's important to understand for people how those two are connected. They're not really separate things. They're different methods the imperialists use to achieve the same ends. And ultimately, when economic warfare fails, they move to the military stage, right? If you look at the war against Russia and Ukraine, think about how that started. There was a massive military buildup by Ukrainian forces, which is basically a NATO army, along the borders of the Donbass. And they were preparing against all of the agreements under Minsk that they'd been ignoring all that time, having fortified most of the country. They were preparing to try to retake the Donbass. At that point, Russia stepped in and launched its SMO to save the Donbass, to liberate, to protect the liberated areas, liberate the rest of Donetsk, or Donetsk, Lugansk, those areas that had tried to be free and separate, and to stop NATO basically ending up in Russia, which was clearly the direction that everything was going in. So when Russia was provoked into that action, as well as sending loads and loads of weapons in to try to boost Ukraine, the Ukrainian NATO side, the West launched a huge economic war on Russia. And their aim was that the economic war was going to do the job for them. They thought that the fighting war part was like a frill. I mean, remember that I think, looking back, all that propaganda that they gave us about Russia's about to invade Ukraine, Russia's about to invade Ukraine, was actually a kind of a smokescreen to cover the fact that they were about to invade Donbass. And they wanted to make it look like they'd done it in defense against an imminent Russian invasion. And Russia pipped them at the post and messed up that narrative. They responded with their massive economic war that they thought was going to bring Russia down, because they'd been telling each other fairy stories about how weak Russia was for a long time, and they'd been giving Russia notice of their intent to destroy Russia for long enough that Russia had been making its preparations. So for various reasons, that failed. But economic warfare and military warfare are intimately linked, Garland. And whether Donald Trump understands that or not doesn't really matter. The whole point is, if they focus on China and engage in a serious, and it's going to keep ratcheting up, right? Imperialism's in a crisis. It's desperate, right? It needs to destroy China as a competitor and make it subservient. Ultimately, it wants to break it into pieces so it can control it, loot it, exploit its labor power for on the lowest possible wages, loot its resources, and keep it, under control. And the economic warfare is a step towards doing that. It wants to weaken China. What does economic warfare mean? Fundamentally, it means finding ways to starve the workers of China. It's not just about. The whole thing about trying to win the battle of competition, that isn't, there's nothing fair about it. The USA will try to use every advantage it has as a massive monopoly capitalist power with its arms, with its technology, with its money. It will try to use everything at its disposal to weaken China economically. What does weakening China economically do? It worsens the life of the people there. It creates social unrest. That's the aim of all these operations. You know, economic warfare is about immiserating a country, weakening it to the point that it feels it has to surrender even without putting up a military resistance, that it's no longer capable of putting up a resistance. You know, so these things are not, it's not like, oh, isn't it good that we just have economic war instead of military war? Oh, well, I mean, to me, a lot of that mindset is like, as long as the people are dying somewhere else, that's fine by me. You know, this whole, oh my God, I don't want nuclear war. What are you talking about? We've got nuclear war. It's happening all the time. What you mean is you don't want a nuclear bomb to land on America. Like, if uranium tipped missiles are landing all over the Middle East and killing generations of babies, that's just fine with you, because that doesn't count as World War III until a bomb lands in Seattle or Washington or LA, you know. And to me, it's the height of hypocrisy to think about the world in that way. And really, it shows you the chauvinism that's engendered in the heads, even of the working class in the West. We're taught to see world war is only world war if the bombs are dropping on our countries. And if they're not, it's just some kind of foreign policy thing that we don't really have to think about or engage with. But, you know, the ramifications are huge for workers everywhere. When we allow our ruling classes to plunder around the world, they are making themselves stronger to oppress us at home. And we become weaker as a result of their strengthening themselves through their brigandage over the planet. You know, it's absolute lunacy for workers in the West to just allow themselves to be bribed off with, you know, whatever it is, cheap iPhones or whatever. They're not that cheap, are they? But you know what I mean. Whatever it is, cheap commodities they're getting that are produced around the world, and say, oh well, it's enough. We've got social peace. The water comes when I turn on the tap, and as long as I've got money to pay for it, by the way. And you know, okay, there's some tent cities down the road, but I can drive a different way, and I don't have to look at them. You know, everything's fine, really. And as long as there's not a nuclear bomb dropping on my head, you know, this is part of what the nuclear blackmail story for me has always been about. It's always been about telling people that they mustn't fight back. You mustn't fight back because the imperialists are lunatics and they've got nuclear weapons. And if they start a nuclear war, nuclear bombs are going to wipe out all of humanity, and then that's that, game over. So anything can happen as long as it's not that. But I think it's nonsense. And I think it's very dangerous mythology that's been built up over all these decades, Garland, through the Cold War and into today, that says a nuclear exchange between, you know, Russia and the USA and China and the USA, those are the things we have to worry about. And everything else is like kind of, you know, low level, you know, oh, if you're interested, pay attention. If you're not, don't worry about it, you know, but not, you've got to do something about it. Not that it affects you, not that it's a problem for you. Yeah, that just, it frustrates me quite badly, actually, the way that people talk about that. Just, what was something I wanted to come back on? Oh, there was something you said about the section of the ruling class which understands that there's a problem. And in Britain, we have this group, I can't remember their exact name. It's like Millionaires with a Conscience or something like that. Hilarious. And every now and again, they'll take out an advert in the Times or somewhere, and there's basically an open letter to the government saying, please charge us more tax.
Yeah, we get that here too. We've got that too. We've got some, well, every time we've got like a bunch of that say we recognize, you know, that the people are suffering and we're perfectly ready to pay more taxes, blah, blah, blah. They do that. But of course, knowing that the government's never really going to do it. But, you know, and they just pretend like amongst us, there's some people that are really nice. We know they're going to do it.
I think there genuinely is a section of the small bourgeois who, you know, do see, probably have more contact with ordinary people and ordinary life, and do see that there's a real problem with the polarization of society, with the massive immiseration at one end and the huge wealth at the other end, and the fact that, you know, all laws, everything benefits the super rich, and we're constantly stealing from the poorest to benefit the richest. And, you know, our infrastructure is falling apart, and there's no healthcare and no education, et cetera, et cetera. and no facilities for poor people, and no housing, all these things. And they're saying, don't you think if we want to keep our position in this society, we need this society to keep functioning in at least a slightly decent way for ordinary people? Because if it doesn't, you can't keep the lid on that forever. And like human logic says, they're right. The problem is capitalist logic can't take those things into consideration. Capitalist logic of the biggest financiers, who are the only ones who really count when it comes to it, says we have to find ways to reinvest this capital at a profit. And everything that's getting in our way has to go. And because it's so difficult to make profit productively now, we've got to cannibalize all the public services and turn them into profit machines. What does that mean? That means the government pays a lot to provide a public service, but it pays a private provider. And the private provider takes most of the money as profit and doesn't really deliver the service. Right? So we're just gifting money to the capitalists to keep them profitable. This is one of many of the things that they're doing to try to keep profit going. And as a result, we have what we have, which is that the country, literally, you see it in every country in the West. You feel that the country is falling apart. Our infrastructure has just absolutely gone to hell. There's no service that you can rely on. Everybody, they're like, there's nobody in Britain, who's in any way involved in ordinary life, who you can meet today, who won't agree with the concept that everything is broken and we just need to rip it up and start again. And really quite conservative people, even quite affluent people, have this sense that everything is stuffed, right? The problem is that people aren't organized as a class to do anything about it. But this millionaires with a conscience thing, I remember several years ago, there was an article, I always forget the author's name, but it was titled "The Pitchforks Are Coming."
Yes, I remember that.
This before, I think, maybe. But it's a cry in the wilderness, isn't it? That even people who benefit from the system can see the contradictions of the system are sharpening in such a way that the whole edifice of the system is threatened, and they're calling out that that's a problem. But it's a cry in the dark. There is literally nothing that the system can do to respond to that. It's in a deep, deep crisis, and it has to follow its own logic.
I think you're right. There was an article here after the election, and it was like in the New York Times, like it said something like, the working class, the whatever, say, "Can you hear us now?" Right? And it was from an old, it was an old, cell phone company that had an advertisement, and the guy walked around, "Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now? Can you hear me now?" About not having enough service. And the article went on to say, look, they just made a point to us that they're rejecting all of this foolishness. And they went to Trump, and, we better start listening to him. And I think that was what it is. The elements of the ruling class that are in touch enough with reality, right, that they can kind of look around. It's kind of obvious. And they're like, it's looking kind of obvious. Things are looking kind of bleak for us. We better make a move. And what I find interesting is that there is still this element of delusion, but there's, I'll put it like this. Right now, when I look at our mainstream media, the analogy I've used is this. When the old boxing match where a boxer gets hit and he's laying on disoriented on a canvas, and he's reaching for his mouthpiece, and he's just laying on the canvas, completely disoriented. Our media, an element of our ruling class right now, represented by our media, are there. They are completely disoriented. They don't know what's going on. They don't know what's happening. You know what I mean? They're like, okay, we're moving forward, and this is what we're doing. It's Russia, it's Ukraine. That's great. And meanwhile, we'll do this. And all of a sudden they got smacked and completely rejected by the masses in a way that they've never seen, because what they were told was minorities will never vote for Trump or leave the Democratic Party or stay home. They did all of the three. Some of them just stayed home, did things that they weren't accustomed to doing. They weren't inured to the traditional factions of the ruling class that they have that have had them under control. And now there seems to me a huge section of the ruling class that is just disoriented. They don't know what to do. They're scratching their head. They're trying to figure out, what do we do now?
It reminds me a little bit, Garland, of what happened in Britain after the Brexit referendum vote, which is very much along the same lines. You know, the reality is that neither of the options on offer to the working class was going to solve all its problems. But it's very true that voting for Brexit was going to disrupt the smooth workings of the imperialist kind of bloc, because Britain's role in the EU was very much a kind of pivotal one in terms of the Atlanticist alliance. It was kind of America's attack dog inside the European Union. Britain was very much responsible for making sure that neither France nor Germany got too independent, and particularly for making sure that the plan for a European army, which was very live in the late 90s and early 2000s, never came to pass. We'd be living in quite a different world in terms of inter-imperialist competition if the EU had managed to sort itself out with a proper armed force. As it was, the European powers remained adjuncts to the US military machine. And that has huge consequences for how the financiers of those countries, you know, have to kind of see themselves and their ability to strategize independently of the USA. You know, there's something about people involved in the lie machine that's always quite interesting to me, which is the way that people can be brought to believe their own press. People who know things are lies in the beginning, but after a while of repeating them and feeling very arrogant and getting rewarded for saying all this shit, you know, they start to tell themselves that it's all really true, you know, and you end up with a machinery that's kind of just full of people who've worked out that this is what you have to say to get paid. And then they're all saying it and they're all reinforcing each other and all telling each other how great they are and getting promoted. And, you know, any dissident voices excluded, demoted, sacked, whatever, not in the gang, you know, so you have this kind of, it's like a grooming circle, right? The problem is that when something comes along that upsets that vision, as you said, it's totally disorientating. These people have got used to having the backing of what seemed to them in the US ruling class, and particularly, you know, the dominant faction of the US ruling class, an unbeatable, you know, big brother, right, that's behind them. And they just get to live in the bask in the glory of being, you know, the children of this, you know, kind of mafia don or whatever. They're like little mini gangsters who don't even have to rough anybody up to get the benefits of hanging around with the big gangster. And they get so much reward for their role that they play in perpetuating the system that they become very, very smug and self-satisfied. And they start to really believe in their brilliance. They also begin to believe that the ruling class is all powerful and can control anything, and that everything that happens is as planned.
Yes.
And what happens for a lot of these people is, you know, they reflect the mentality of the ruling class itself, which consistently fails to take into account the ability of the workers to think, to respond, to act in ways that they decide are better for them. Now, it's true that a lot of the people who voted for Donald Trump, just like a lot of the people who voted for Brexit, have done so based on a hope that a bunch of things are going to happen to make their lives better. But they've also done it. What's common to both of those votes, very noticeably common, is a strong sense of disruption. It's like a two fingers at the establishment. The more the establishment screams at you not to do something, when you're in a situation where your life has been getting worse for decades and the establishment has just poured scorn on you and ignored you, and patently disregards and despises you, then the idea that you're in a position to go along to those people and as the establishment and lecture them and hector them about what's good for them, when you've spent the last 4 decades, treating them that way, it shows you how kind of pathologically superior the ruling class feels itself to be. You remember Hillary Clinton talking about the basket of deplorables, in public. Like it's like the people don't have ears, like it's not going to get back to them, and the thing is, people know how the establishment feels about them. They don't often get a chance to stick their 2 fingers up. In Britain, the EU referendum was very much perceived by the mass of poor workers, and particularly in the industrial heartlands where they'd been, unemployed for like 2 generations, as an opportunity to rock the boat. And to be honest with you, for a lot of those people, it was the first time they'd had such an opportunity, a referendum like we had for Brexit, with 1 question. Every single vote counted. It was a national vote. It wasn't gerrymanderable. It was like yes or no. And like which way you vote will influence what happens to the country. Like this never happens to us in Britain. Our voting system's like so labyrinthine that most people know that if you vote, it makes absolutely no difference. So, there was a big wave of anti-establishment kind of energy went into that vote. There was a high turnout for the referendum. There was a lot of anti-establishment feeling, and the establishment got the vote that it did not instruct the workers to deliver. And it was shocked. The response, Garland? We had a 3.5-year parliamentary sit-in. Parliament did nothing. All our elected representatives did nothing for 3.5 years except for debate and argue over how not to do Brexit. Literally, that's all they did in Parliament for 3.5 years after that vote. So exactly the same sort of dislocation, I think, is what you're seeing amongst sections of the US ruling class and media right now. Donald Trump is not how they wanted the workers to vote. They think the workers are supposed to just do as they're told. And I do think, I said to you when we talked about the election of Donald Trump before that, you should really take into account how many people didn't vote. Because I think huge numbers of people have given up entirely in the left versus right, Democrats versus Republicans, Trump versus Biden, or Kamala, whatever. They don't really buy into any of it. They're pretty sure it's going to make no difference. But definitely there was a groundswell, as you said, across every part of the poor working class. There were sections who, the ruling class are always convinced, no, they would only ever vote Democrat, who didn't, who voted for Donald Trump. Because, and I think the reason is literally that they sense the angst of the dominant section of the ruling class. They sense that if this is a disruptive act, and they want to be disruptive of the status quo, because the status quo is very clearly not serving them. Now, they're not going to get all the things Donald Trump has promised them. As we said, he represents a section of the ruling class which is harnessing the anger of the masses. But the anger of the masses is very real. And their quest for change that benefits them is not going to stop. Having elected Donald Trump, when he can't deliver the change they want, where's all that energy going to go? This is a long, slow, and painful process for workers in the West, that they gradually get disillusioned with the bourgeois parties. But then what happens to them? Now, our ruling class, we've talked about this many times, Garland, the immigration debate, if you want to call it that, but the constant immigration hysteria that fills bourgeois media and the mouths of many bourgeois politicians, 24/7, night and day, week after week, month after month, year after year. The reason is because they need to give the working class scapegoats as they are becoming disillusioned with the establishment. They need to offer them what look like alternatives that don't threaten the system. And that means keeping them fighting themselves. So the ruling class will present more and more righter and righter-wing demagogues, more and more fascistic. But essentially, they're saying the same thing that all the bourgeois politicians have been saying forever. Let's not forget that the most number of immigrants deported from the USA in recent history, probably ever, was under President Obama, right? Who's the liberals' favorite. So this is not even to do with right wing and left wing of the ruling class as a policy or as a strategy. But as the workers lose faith in representatives of the main bourgeois establishment parties to be able to deliver what they need, and they're going to lose faith because as the crisis gets deeper, it becomes more obvious that the crisis can't be reversed by any of the so-called policy differences. So they lose faith. There's two options. You know, either the working class and kind of ruined small business people get pulled into the camp of some demagogue who points the finger of blame at some minority or other, some section of the population, or it might be some people abroad, but you know, it will be some scapegoat, probably a few scapegoats mixed together, or they organize themselves as a class to change the system. Because fundamentally, and of course, you know, if they get caught up behind the demagogues, they will become foot soldiers for more war. That's the only thing that the ruling class really wants them to do, you know, to get out, to help them get out of their crisis by willingly fighting in their wars or cheering their wars on or facilitating in some way the war machine under the deluded belief that their lives are going to get better as a result. They're not. This is capitalism, people. What we actually need to do is recognize that the only way out of all of this is to break the Gordian knot entirely, organize ourselves in our own interests as working class people together, all working class people together, fighting for socialism, rather than sets of working class people fighting for their section of the ruling class, somehow identifying themselves with one or another section of the ruling class. That's a trick that's played on us, to treat politics and the national life as if it's a baseball game and we've got our team and the other team are our enemy. You know, and this is the way that the capitalists have played the working class for the entirety that their system has been in existence. As you said right at the beginning, sections of the ruling class will try to mobilize and successfully have and do mobilize parts of the working class into their camp and use them to fight the section on the other side, which means workers are fighting workers in the interests of two groups of capitalists. And none of that is actually in the interests of workers. What we need is to fight for our own cause, which is, of course, socialism.
Joti Brar, everyone, we've got a join button now, so click the little join button to become a member of the channel, and certainly share this on all your social media platforms. Joti, where can everybody find you and all of your fine works?
Thanks, Garland. So my party's website is thecommunists.org, an excellent website where you will get analysis you don't get anywhere else in the English language. You can find me, Joti Brar, on Telegram, and my party, The Communists, on Telegram also. We're also on Twitter, but I definitely recommend Telegram as a much more useful place to get information from. And we have a YouTube channel called Proletarian TV, where you can get lots of great videos, especially of meetings and presentations and things a little bit more in depth. I would also really ask people who are new to the concepts that I try to bring into these conversations, you know, I can introduce, a very brief overview, a broad overview of some of these ideas. But fundamentally, you know, if we want to act in our own interests, we have to educate ourselves. Our party's website has a tab on it that says learn. And under there is a click on something called Marxist Study Program. And I really, really recommend to people to go there, to click on that, and to start to educate themselves in what Marxist science is. Don't believe what people tell you Marxism is. Find out for yourself. It is the most empowering thing you can do.
Awesome. Thank you very much, Joti, and look forward to having you back on again next week. Well, I'm sure that the imperialists will be up to no good, particularly over the next, between now and the 20th. God only knows what they're going to do, but hopefully you'll be available next week and we will figure it out and keep going and have a lot of fun. I really enjoy these discussions. I learn a lot, and I'm sure our people too. I want to thank the guys over at the Greenville Post, that GREANVILLE, Greenville Post, Patrice and Jeff Brown, etc. They always put these videos up and expose a lot of people to them. So thanks everyone over at the Greenville Post. And everyone else, you guys and girls, please share this on all your social media platforms. Thank you very much. And we are out.